this week's Torah portion. We talked a little bit last week regarding some of the background of some characters that were at play. And some of those was, as I mentioned before, was Balaam. And Balaam comes back into play again today. But we're going to talk a little bit more about Pharaoh and some of the different Hebrew words that we've learned some before, and we're going to learn some again today. And so we're going to bounce around a little bit. Well, I shouldn't say we're going to bounce around, but we're going to bounce between Hebrew and a couple of different concepts. So there's a couple things specifically like for Pharaoh. One of the things that's interesting about Pharaoh is that a lot of times I get questions of how could God harden his heart? That seems so unfair. That's unfair that he did that to Pharaoh. But that's not what the Hebrew says. May get that takeaway. We may come to that conclusion from the English, but that's not what the Hebrew says. And so in this week's Torah portion, we get to verse 6, and it says, Adonai says, I hear in this, and remember this word, Shema. He's Shemati, so he's hearing, like we talk about. I have heard the groanings of Israel, and because of their hard bondage or their hard servitude that's taken place. And what does he say? I remembered my covenant. That word to remember is zaker, or if you'd like to see it, it's also right there. Ve'e zaker, zakor. It means to remember. One of the commands that we should remember this from is about Shabbat. So there's two commands about Shabbat, shomer and or shamar, which means to guard, and zaker, so to remember the Shabbat. So here we see Adonai, he is remembering his covenant, his brit. So it says, Zakor et briti, my covenant that I have made. And so then he goes and says to Moshe, say to, therefore, to Israel, I am Ani Adonai, and I will free you from your labors of the labors of Egyptians, and deliver you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm, and through extraordinary chastisements. And I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I, Adonai, am your God, who freed you from the labors of the Egyptians. And as Greg mentioned earlier, this is where the four cups come from. And it is why, if you've ever been to other Passover Seders, why ours is a little bit different from some of them, not all of them, because some of them are interchangeable, if you will, but it's from these Hebrew words that I got the four cups. So that's why the third one is the cup of redemption, and then the fourth one is the cup of praise, but it's also really the one that also says it's about marriage. And I find that to be interesting because that word that Greg was mentioning, the lachach, means also to take hand in marriage. So I'm going to redeem you, but then I'm going to take your hand in marriage. That was in verse 7. And I just thought I'd throw that in there since that kind of piggybacks sort of what you had been talking about. And so then he says, I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you as for a possession. I am Ani Adonai. So again, he's repeating. I'm talking a little bit about that covenant. And what was that covenant that was made with Abraham? There's three things that are mentioned in Genesis. The first one is, I am Adonai Almighty. Okay, so I am, it says in the English translation, I am Lord God Almighty. The second is, walk before me and be blameless. Those are the three things that are essentially the three requirements that he gives to Abraham. Because Abraham was already faithful, and what's interesting is even in that word, he was faithful, the word is amen, which is the same letters, aleph, mem, nun, as we say after prayer. But that prayer is also, or I should say that acronym, or that word is actually an acronym. Those letters are referred to an acronym, which means aleph, el, mem, melech, and then the nun is ne'iman, which God, who is king, who is faithful or trustworthy to do what he says he's going to do. And here we see that Moses is being reminded that God is remembering, Adonai is remembering his covenant with his people. It is time to remember that covenant, if you will. And we've talked about this before. We've talked about when Israel is in exile, that the nations that take them are not to abuse them. And if they do abuse them, then there is, some punishment that takes place against them. Remember, they are given authority over the Jewish people or over Israel for a period of time, but they are not to abuse that authority and go into what we call power. I've talked about that before. There's a difference between having an authority over and the power to do something. So authority means you have given the permission to do it. Power just means you have the might to do it. And so, anyways, we have Moses. He's saying, okay, this is what Adonai is telling him, and he goes to Israel. He goes to the children of Israel, Bnei Israel, and what happens? Velo shamo'u. They didn't listen. They did not hear. And I thought this was interesting. As I'm digging into this a little bit more, I'm going, lo shamu. It's not because they didn't know. It's not. It doesn't talk about yada. Doesn't talk about knowing. As we've talked about yadat, or da'at, which means knowledge. It's not that they didn't have knowledge of God. They just weren't ready to hear it. Have you ever encountered somebody like that where you're talking to them and maybe that timing of what you're saying to them is not the right time? They're not ready to receive it, what you're saying. As they say in other parts, they're not picking up what you're laying down, not smelling what you're stepping in. That expression, those ideas, this is what Israel is dealing with right now. And Moses is going, I'm trying to share this with them, but they would not listen because why? Their hearts or their spirits, in this case, the ruach, had been crushed or oppressed by their servitude. They couldn't listen because in their world it was too hard to believe that it would come true. And so then in 10, Adonai continues to speak to Moses, saying, go to Pharaoh and go tell Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, to let Bnei Israel depart from this land. But Moses appealed to Adonai, saying, the Bnei Israel would not listen to me. How then should Pharaoh heed me when I, who gets tongue-tied? Now remember last week we talked a little bit about the story of Moshe from the scroll of Jasher. This is where they connect, saying this is where Moses says, who I'm tongue-tied. I think some translations say that I have a stutter, or I have a lisp, or I can't speak well. A number of different things. The scroll of Jasher we talked about. This is where he took the crown off of Pharaoh's head, and they said, oh my goodness, this is a bad omen. You need to kill this baby, kill this child now. Anyways, then it was brought forth, well, no, let's bring forth gold, and let's bring forth hot coals, and let's see what he does with it. And he takes the coal, eventually he takes the coal, and he touches his tongue and burns his tongue. This is what the rabbis, some of the rabbis suggest, as well as the scroll of Jasher connects with it as well, and saying he had a difficulty speaking because he had taken that hot coal and he had burned his tongue. And so he recognizes that his lack of speaking abilities, and so he's responding and saying, if the Bnei Israel would not listen to me, how should Pharaoh then listen to me if I can't even speak very well? So Adonai spoke to both Moses and Aaron gets included here in regard to Israel, Bnei Israel, and Pharaoh, king of Egypt, instructing them to deliver the Bnei Israel from the land of Egypt. And notice in here, it's interesting, this word Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is the word for Egypt. If you want to see what it looks like, there it is right there. That's that last word. Mitzrayim comes from a couple different root words, but the word means to siege. It means to oppress. So the very place that they are is in a place of oppression, which eventually becomes an actual place of oppression. So they went there to be saved from the famine, but they didn't leave. They hung out there. They continued to live there. And then, and now in Mitzrayim, there's this oppression that took place that we talked about last week with the slow taxation as well as taking away their wages and enslaving Bnei Israel, except for all 11 tribes, except for the tribe of Levi. The tribe of Levi did not go in there, and that's why Aaron is free to go with Moses up there. Kind of helps make it a little bit more sense, because if all of Israel was enslaved, how can Aaron break free to go talk to Pharaoh? But if the Levites were living in the land of Goshen and were still removed, were not included in this slavery, we can see how Aaron then was free to join Moses or Moshe into the court of Pharaoh. And so it said that they went to Pharaoh, and in the scroll of Jasher, it offers a little interesting scenario. It says that as they approached, Pharaoh's palace had two large lions that were chained, but were kind of able to be, able to move around and so forth. And the idea is you could not approach Pharaoh without going past these lions, or, which more specifically, if the Pharaoh did not summon you, the lions remained there as sort of guard dogs, except for, in this case, large guard cats. And they were fed just enough to sort of keep them alive, but not enough to keep them not hungry or not satiated. And so so Moshe and Aaron, they're coming up, and they use the stick that Aaron's going to use later to cast down. If you remember the one that Moshe had out in Midian, and they used this stick, and they freed the lions, and the lions joined them as they walked into the palace, happy as a puppy that just came from the field. And this was something that got Pharaoh's attention. Okay, so because keep in mind, Pharaoh's the king of Egypt. Moshe is an outcast at this point. He's a bandit because he killed one of the slave masters, right? He killed the slave master, ran off, and now he's returned. So his position with Pharaoh is, questionable at this point. So if he comes in with this, hey, these are the two lions that are supposed to, keep anybody from walking in uninvited, and they're not only with them, but they're with them happy as they can be. So this gets Pharaoh's attention. Now, according to the scroll of Jasher, it kind of gives him a little bit of some fear. So in this portion of the Torah, we get into some of the names of the different people that are the leaders of some tribes. And as we move further down past that section into 26, this is the same Moses and Aaron to whom Adonai said, "Bring forth Israel, Bnei Israel, from the land of Egypt, tribe by tribe." And it was they who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to free the Israelites from the Egyptians. These are the same Moses and Aaron. And you'll notice again in verse 30, Moses appeals again to Adonai, saying, "I get tongue-tied." That's that same word that I was talking about before with his mouth and his tongue, if you will. And so Adonai responds to Moshe, and he says, "See, I place you in a role of a god to Pharaoh. with your brother Aharon as his prophet. So he tells Moshe, you're going to go to Pharaoh and you are going to be like an Elohim. I'm going to give you this position of Elohim to Pharaoh. And you can see that here it is Natanta Neta Ticha Elohim la Paro. So you have, I'm going to, the same. This is the same root word as Natan, Notain, who gave us the Torah. We say Notain Torah. So here we have that same word that's being used. So he gave Elohim, he's given Moshe as Elohim to Pharaoh, or for Pharaoh, and Aharon is a Navi. So we have, on this one right here, we have a Navi. So he is a Navi, as a prophet. Okay, he's the spokesman for this God. And then he tells Moshe, speak what I tell you. You and your brother shall speak to Pharaoh, and basically tell Pharaoh to let Bnei Israel to depart from this land. And so here we get the first passage, Exodus 7, verse 3, and it says, but I will harden Pharaoh's heart that I may multiply my signs and marvels in the land. Okay, here we go. Let's break this down. Adonai says, I'm going to something to Pharaoh. So we have Pharaoh right here, Parashat, and he's going to harden or make it difficult. Okay? So how does he do that? How does Adonai do this? There's a word, some specific words we want to pay attention to this. But he's going to make it difficult for, basically, let's put it this way. He's going to encourage Pharaoh in a way that he's going to have a hard time letting Israel go. Okay, so he's not like kind of convincing him against his will. We'll see that as we go through this. But instead of convincing him against his will, he's going to encourage him to sort of look at his glory and look at his own self and think about himself and what this means if these Israelites, Bnei Israel, is let go. So, and he's doing this why? So that I may multiply my signs and marvels in the land. Now, I want to stop for a second, and I want to just kind of offer you something that I found interesting. And I'm going to open up another Sepharia here, because you'll see why in just one second. So, this word, maybe I need to make it a little bit bigger. Oh, no, it dropped. So in Exodus 7 verse 3, we have the word Pharaoh right here. Okay, so that word is Pharaoh. We have a Pei Resh Ayin Hey. Now, something I find interesting, and I just learned this just recently while we were in Colorado Springs. I had the opportunity to put on tefillin, and there was something that took place inside of there that I was like, wait a second, this is really interesting. And when you tie on tefillin, when you put it on your head, you put the phylactery on between your eyes or above your upper forehead. But there's a knot that goes on the base back here. And I thought, as I was praying through this, I said, this is interesting. The back of our head right here, so science has shown the back of our brain right here is where our animalistic desires live. These are the important functions for us to live. Our hunger function, our, if you damage this part of the brain, you don't live. Or a lot of functions get messed up. We have our thinking part up here and so forth. This is, as we've talked about, this is more of the soul, but this back part, that's where the knot is. But what I was shown is, again, so here's Pharaoh, Pei, Resh, Ayin, Hey. When we see the word for stiff-necked people, we have Ayin, Resh, Fe. oref. The back of the neck, as you can see here, stiff of neck. So Pharaoh is named with the inverse letters of the stiffness of our neck. But they're related. And so when we put on tefillin, that's to remind us that we're binding. Why are we binding? Because we're trying to bind or subdue our animalistic behaviors, our yetzer hara, or as Paul calls it, our flesh. We're trying to subdue that they don't get out of control. We talked about that with the 7 spirits of boundary. We got to keep them. They're beautiful things that Adonai has given us, but we've got to maintain control over them, lest they be like, fire is great, except for when it's on your drapes, right? Fire is great in the fireplace; it keeps you warm and so forth. But if that fire gets out of control, it can be very destructive to your house. So, just a little side note. So, when we're talking about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, we got a little bit of some stiffness of neck that applies to this equation as well. So, he says, when Pharaoh does not heed you, I will lay my hand upon Egypt and deliver my ranks, my people, Bnei Israel, from the land of Egypt with an extraordinary chastisement. And then he says, Veyadeu Mitzrayim. That root word is yada, which is to know. Who's going to know? Egyptians will know what? Ki ani Adonai. I am Adonai. So all of this is taking place so that the Egyptians shall also know, because Israel already knows Adonai. Now it's the Egyptians to also know. And when we think about this as, again, an exile, and one of the 4 things was Geula, I guess it's Ge'ati, Ge'alati, but Geula is redemption. Part of this redemption is we are waiting for a Geula, a redeemer, and so Israel already knows about Adonai, but Mitzrayim does not. And the sages say that when it comes to some of the deaths of these plagues and other things, some of the believers, as Greg mentioned before, some of these believers in the God of Israel who remembered Joseph, they were protected as well. This is some of the things that the sages say. Because keep in mind, when they left as a mixed multitude. Where did all these animals come from? Not only just from the land of Goshen, but also from some of the other Egyptians that also believed. And so, as a result, when I stretch out my hand over Egypt and bring out Israel from their midst, it symbolizes an idea of there will be others, or I should say it includes others from Mitzrayim to join themselves to Israel as they come out. And this Moses and Aaron did, as Adonai had commanded. And then it gives us the ages when they went to visit Pharaoh. Okay? Now in verse 9 it says, when Pharaoh speaks to you and says, produce your marvel, you shall say to Aaron, take your rod and cast it down, as we talked about before, and it shall turn into a serpent. Now this word is not nachash, which is typical, the word for snake. This word for serpent is an old Hebrew word that nobody really seems to know. Some think it may have been a dragon. Some think it might have been like a crocodile form. Either way, it turns into something that it wasn't when it falls onto the ground. And Moses, when they came before Pharaoh, did just as Adonai commanded. Again, how did they get the attention? They showed up with his lions that were supposed to eat him. So they come before Pharaoh, they cast that down, and his and in the presence of Pharaoh and courtiers, and it turned into a serpent. Then Pharaoh, for his part, summoned the sages and the sorcerers, and the Egyptian magician priests in turn did the same with their spells. Now, if you've ever watched the cartoon Prince of Egypt, you'll see that there was two men that were represented as those who could reproduce many of the same things that Moshe and Aaron did. We know their name. We find it in 2 Timothy chapter 3. Oh, now I'm looking in the wrong place. Oh, there it is. Verse 8. All right, so let's start out in verse 6. For among them are those who creep into households and capture weak women, burdened with sins, and lay astray various passions, always learning and never able to arrive at a knowledge of truth, just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses. So these men also opposed the truth, men corrupted in mind and disqualified regarding the faith. Now, what's interesting about Jannes and Jambres is they're not mentioned anywhere in Torah, but they are mentioned in the scroll of Jasher. And coming back to Balaam, they happen to be Balaam's sons. So Balaam's sons, Jannes and Jambres, are hanging out in Egypt, in Mitzrayim, and they are performing these similar magical arts or, these spells and so forth. And so they, according to the scroll of Jasher, they said, well, if he's no different than us, if he can cast, throw that rod down and turn it into serpents and so forth. But if his serpent eats ours, and then we grab it and they reseparate, then we know that he has the true Spirit of God. So keep in mind, this Pharaoh also, on top of that, when Moshe came to Pharaoh and Aaron came to him, they said, our God, the God of Israel, the God of the Hebrew, says to let us go. They went to this book. They went to this book of names. And this is why we know it wasn't the same Pharaoh or dynasty that was associated with Joseph, because they would have known the name of the God of Joseph. But this Pharaoh that came from the south, if you will, Upper Nile, when they came in, they brought in with them the book of the names of gods. And the names of God that was given by Moshe and Aaron was not in this book. And so one of them actually suggested, it's just a son of a wise man. That's all it is. It's not really a name of an important god of any peoples. But unbeknownst to them, this is going to be problematic for their thinking. So they cast out the rod, but Aaron's rod, in verse 12, swallowed their rods. This is Jannes and Jambres. And so when they picked it back up, they went back to being the rods. Or as scroll of Jasher suggests, that actually as rods it began to swallow. However you want to look at it, either way, it was certainly a sign that got their attention. But here we go again. Now what's going on with Pharaoh's heart? Verse 13. Vayechazak lev Paro. Chazak, which we should remember, is what we say at the end of a reading of a book. We say chazak, chazak, benit, chazek, right? That is the same word. But how do we translate it? Do you guys remember? How do we translate it? Chazak, chazak, benit, chazek. We translate it as be strong, and let us together be strengthened, right? That's what we mean by chazak. So here, it's going to annoy me. What was that? Was that 733? Greg? Is that where it was? Nope, it wasn't. Maybe it was 633. That's where it was. Okay, so now there's 7. Let's see. Shoot. Where did it go? There we go. 13. Sorry, 7:13. There we go. It bounced on me, and I had 33 in my head. So if you look at it, you see that word chazak, which means to strengthen, prevail, harden, be strong, become strong, be courageous, be firm, grow firm, be resolute, be sore. So think about it in this way. Chazak means to be strengthened in a way to overcome. Okay, so when we say chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek, we're saying be strong and be strong to overcome the challenges, the trials, the things that we have in life. And here is the word that is used to what? He chazak lev. His Pharaoh's heart was strengthened, and velo shema. He would not listen. And then in next verse, we see why. And Adonai said to Moshe, Pharaoh is stubborn. He refuses to let the people go. But what is the word that he's using there? The word that's being used is kaved. Kaved is so really close to the word kavod, which means glory, but it's written in a way that it's a personal glory. It's a self-interest, the heaviness of his position. I am Pharaoh. Who are these? I almost said a word that would have been inappropriate. That revolves around circumcision. But who are these two young men that showed up that are telling me these things and telling me to let them go? His position of his heart. So this is kaved lev paro. And if you look at all the different plagues, as you go through them, the first few, it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart. No, it says that he chazak his heart. He rose up to courage. I'm stubborn because of my position, but I believe I'm going to overcome. I believe I'm going to overcome these deals. And he doesn't repent. That's the interesting thing, is he does not repent. He just says, oh, make it go away, make it go away. Doesn't even say I'm sorry. Make it go away, make it go away. Because in his mind, he was not interested in listening because A, he did not know Yada, Adonai, and he was more worried about his position than he was about listening. So then, that's where they go to the Nile in the morning to see where Pharaoh is. Now, the sages say that the reason that they went to the Nile in the morning, as he's coming out of the water, that's an expression for every morning Pharaoh would get up and go into the water, take a dip in the Nile River, if you will, and he would relieve himself, because as a god, he should not be seen as relieving himself. And so, as he's coming out, you take the rod that turned into a snake, and you're going to turn it into blood. Well, first they say, let us go, that we may worship. And he said, no. And so he turns it into blood. They touch it to the blood, or touch to the water. And the fish in the Nile will die. The Nile will stink so that the Egyptians will find it impossible to drink the water of the Nile. And Adonai said to Moshe, say to Aaron, take your rod and hold it out over the waters of Egypt, its rivers, its canals, and its ponds, all of its bodies of water, that they may turn into blood. There shall be blood throughout the land of Egypt, even in the vessels of wood and stone, which is interesting because as you read, Revelation 16, it talks about the same thing with the first two bowls. Bowls, right? Yeah, bowls in that one. Yeah. And so we have the same thing where the water turns into blood in that situation. And so Moshe did that, and everything turned to blood. And the fish in the Nile died, and the waters began to stink, which would make sense. But Jannes and Jambres, they were able to do the same with their spells. And what do we have with Pharaoh? Chazak lev paro. So he strengthened his heart, saying, well, my guys can do the same thing. which is interesting because you would think if your rivers were now stinking and the fish had died, you would say, hey, undo what they did. But no, they're like, hey, let's add to it and we can do it too. As if somehow that was, I guess, they matched the power rather than showing it themselves as actually greater than Moshe and Aaron. And this seems to be the sequence until they cannot replicate that the plagues, if you will. And so I continue to find that irony of, anything you can do, we can do too, and let's just make everybody worse. I mean, I guess misery loves company, so to speak. But anyways, I guess Jannes and Jambres joined the party and said, let's just, no, that's not bad enough. We'll make it worse by adding to it. And so Pharaoh went to his palace, paying no regard to what had just taken place. And as a result, all of the Egyptians had to dig around the Nile for drinking water because they could not drink the water of the Nile. So something that is interesting about this is a little side note, if you will join me. It is, have you ever heard of an Egyptian well? If you've been around people that are involved in like survivalists or wilderness outfitting and other things like that, most of them know what an Egyptian well is. And that's where you take these different layers of rocks and so forth, and you can purify water within the ground and make water drinkable from the ground. And this is what the Egyptians had to do. So if you ever have somebody who says, I don't believe in the Bible and so forth, well, do you know what an Egyptian well is? Maybe they'll know. If they don't, if they do know what it is, say, did you know that came as a result of the plague of blood? That's the reason why we know about the Egyptian wells, which, again, arguably, according to the scroll of Jasher, was how Israel was able to maintain and have fresh water. So after 7 days, again, so this tells you the mentality of Pharaoh. 7 days after they struck the Nile, Adonai said to Moshe, go to Pharaoh and say to him, thus says Adonai, let my people go that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, then I will plague your whole house, your whole country with frogs. And the Nile swarm with frogs, and they shall come up and enter your palace, your bedchamber, your houses, courtiers, and your people, and your ovens, and your kneading bowls. Everywhere. The frogs shall come upon you and upon your people and all your courtiers. And Adonai said, say to Aaron, hold out your arm over the rivers and canals and ponds, and bring up the frogs on the land. Aaron held out and did exactly as that was. But then Jannes and Jambres did the same thing. Anything you can do, we can do too, and make it worse. And they brought frogs upon the land of Egypt, adding insult to injury, I guess, right? And so then Pharaoh summoned, maybe this is what they needed, maybe Adonai was using this to say, you know what, just their frogs that Moses and Aaron did, let's double down with these two knuckleheads and have them add to it, maybe, I don't know. And so anyways, Pharaoh summoned. So this is the first time Pharaoh summons Moshe and Aaron and says, plead with Adonai to remove the frogs from me and my people, and I will let the people go to sacrifice to Adonai. This is interesting because he's not saying, so we've talked about this before, this is not and the plague is not about punishment. Sometimes we look at these plagues as a punishment. But when Pharaoh tells him to go pray, it's a different word. It's atar. Atar is a different word than palal. Palal means to open shepherd's judgment, but atar means to pray and supplicate in a different way of praying. So this is not about punishment, because what is the plagues about? Let's remind ourselves. To help Egypt get the knowledge of God. So Moshe's going to pray. So it's interesting. He says, go and pray to your God to remove these frogs. And then I will let you go and offer an offering, a zavach le'Adonai. And Moshe said to Pharaoh, you may have this triumph over me. For what time shall I plead on behalf of you and your courtiers and your people, that the frogs be cut off from you, your houses to remain only in the Nile. So notice what Moshe's response is. Adonai tells him, of course. He says, tell me a time and a day when you want this to take place. And Pharaoh replies, Vayomer lamachar, tomorrow in the morning. So he wanted to go another night with frogs. Very interesting. As you say, that you may know that there is none like our God. Ki Adonai, well, I should say, Ein ka Adonai Eloheinu. There is none. Ein is there is not. And the kaf in front means like. Adonai Eloheinu. And so the frogs shall retreat from you and from your courtiers, and they shall remain only in the Nile. And so they did that, and they died. And it says that they piled them up in heaps until the land stank. But when Pharaoh saw some relief, what did he do? Something with his heart. Let's take a look. What did he do with his heart? He hakaved et lavu, his heart. So now again, it's back to his glory about his position. And velo shema, he did not hear alechem. He did not hear them. Did not listen to their word, Daver Adonai. Did not listen to those words of Adonai. And so then we go through the dust and we continue on. And so we could go through this a lot more if you wanted to, but you'll see that there's this play between Chazak and Kaved for Pharaoh. And so when it's not about this mean God who comes down and hardens Pharaoh's heart beyond what he was, against his will, but instead all he did is just gave him a little bit of coaching and saying, this guy's already a bad apple. He's already got an oref. He's already got a stiff neck. All I'm going to do is encourage him to exercise that and be that nudge, if you will. He's going to be that one that I'm going to use to what? Bring knowledge of Adonai to the Egyptians, so that when they leave, those Egyptians in that place have an opportunity as well to join themselves to Israel. And so I just wanted to kind of share that, okay, so if somebody says, how could Adonai do it? Well, no, he didn't stiffen him against his will. All he did is he encouraged him to think about his position, to think that he could overcome, because he's Pharaoh. He's the main dude. Why does he have to defecate in the river? Because gods do not defecate. He's above man. Through his own deception, he had to keep up an image, if you will, that he really could not. And so it's through that process that he saw himself as, Pharaoh was often considered to be the son of Ra, the son of the sun god. And so he had an image to uphold, not only as king, but also as this God to the people of Mitzrayim that overcame the nation that was in place under Joseph. That's why this Pharaoh that did not know Joseph, or I should say that's an explanation of this Pharaoh that arose that knew not Joseph and what Joseph's God had done for those Egyptians. But there were still those Egyptians in the land that did know. Just this Pharaoh did not. And his cabinet, if you will, did not. And so with this, so this word chazak has a positive meaning, but it also has a negative meaning in terms of strengthening. Strength can be a good thing when it's used in the proper place, but it can also be used just like we see with stubbornness. Sometimes we see, especially some individuals, or when we see our kids doing things, uh, we would argue a rebellion and so forth. It's like, man, if you had used that energy that you have for good and not for this other, just amazing what it could, what it would be. And yet we see that throughout history, time and again. And in the end of days, we'll probably see the same thing, that this Yada Adonai is going to be what that final redemption is going to be all about. The whole world will know that he is Adonai, which we see in, and I'll just pull it up real quickly up here in the English, in Jeremiah 31. And this is part of that new covenant that we've talked about before. And I'll start in verse 31. It says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares Adonai, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares Adonai. For this is the covenant that I will make the house of Israel. For after those days, declares Adonai, I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God. They shall be my people." Verse 34 is the key one. "And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, Know Adonai, for they shall all know me. From the least of them to the greatest, declares Adonai, for I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more." Notice the connection. What happens in this final galut? When Geula, when Yeshua returns, all will know that he is Adonai. So these tribulations, these plagues, and all these things that are predicted, prophesied to come in the final days, what is the reason for them? For all of the world to see that Adonai is the true God. They will come to know that Adonai is the true God. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, we thank you for your many blessings. We thank you that for this encouragement, that these plagues and just the things that go on in our lives, even the trials that we have in our lives, all these things are so often to help us remember that it is to bring about knowledge of you. Father, I pray that you would just strengthen us in each of our places, wherever we may be in our walk with you, Father, that would, our lives, we would live a life that people would look at it and say, I see that God is with you. Just like we see in Zechariah, 10 men of the nations would grab a hold of the tzitzit of a Jew and say, I see God is with you. Can you teach me his ways? Father, we know that all of this is about knowledge of you, teaching others the knowledge of you. And so, Father, we just ask for wisdom. We've asked for strength, and that you would just help us, oh Lord, to just continue to walk in your ways and be blameless before you as we recognize you are the sovereign God. We give you praise and glory. B'Shem Yeshua.